I'll start off here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's talk. My name is Anna Rue, and I am here to introduce Lorraine Gilbertson of Vesterheim Norwegian-American Museum. Lorraine received her bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's degree in textiles and clothing from Iowa State University. She's the chief curator at Vesterheim and in Decorah, Iowa, and previously served as the textile curator there for nearly 20 years. She's also contributed to Dressing with Purpose, the book Belonging and Resistance in Scandinavia in 2021. If you haven't seen that, it's a really remarkable book, and also pieces in Norwegian-American Women, Migration, Communities, and Identities in 2011. She writes for popular magazines, including Piecework and Vesterheim magazine, and she's a frequent and popular presenter among Norwegian-American organizations and community groups in the Midwest. So I'm very excited to be here with you for her talk, and we'll save questions for the final about 15 minutes here, and Lorraine will begin here and talk about T-shirts and Texas Bunad. So thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you, Anna, and greetings to you all from Vesterheim Norwegian-American Museum. Vesterheim has been pleased to be part of the Crossings 2025 Planning Committee. Many Norwegian-Americans choose to express an ethnic identity by observing family traditions, joining cultural organizations, attending festivals, or by their choice of clothing. Clothing choices might include an Ufta t-shirt, a Norwegian sweater, a red vest, a solja brooch, or an outfit called a bunad, and the plural of bunad is bunader. Bunader worn in the United States range from reconstructions of historic dress to contemporary designer outfits inspired by traditions to personalized and freely composed interpretations. Since about 1960, there's been a proliferation of U.S. bunader, outfits created to represent American communities in the same way that bunader have been designed in Norway to represent the cultural history and natural environment of Norwegian communities. Clothing is an important marker of ethnic identity in the United States today. As one person explained to me, a bunad keeps the connection, and it's easy to connect. You don't have to learn the language or study cooking techniques. You just pull it out of the closet and put it on. You instantly feel Norwegian. Over the next hour, we'll explore choices in Norwegian clothing and how the bunad has been adapted and transformed in the American context. There's been a shift from first expressing a national and then regional Norwegian identity to sharing a more personalized Norwegian or Norwegian-American identity. In Norway, there are several terms used to describe different types of outfits, such as differentiating clothing firmly based in tradition to simplified versions meant for work. Today, however, I'm going to use the word bunad for any outfit of clothing with Norwegian characteristics, because this reflects the way the word is used in the United States. Informing this presentation are interviews with Americans and Norwegians, the activities and histories of Norwegian-American cultural organizations, and the histories of artifacts at Vesterheim Norwegian-American Museum. By the late 19th century in Norway, rural customs including dancing, music, fine handcraft, and folk dress were in decline. A cultural revival soon began. In both small communities and large cities, dedicated men and women researched, taught, and celebrated traditional skills and products. The Norwegian Handicraft Association, Den Norske Husflidsforening or Husfliden, coordinated a national network of craft classes, exhibitions, and shops selling objects made by local artisans, as well as supplies for folk art. This period of nationalism culminated in independence from Sweden in 1905. At this time, a national costume, which was a simplified version of the Hardanger bunad, became popular. This outfit of red bodice, beaded breastplate, lace-trimmed blouse and apron, and black skirt was called nasjonaldrakt. Nasjonaldrakt was very popular in Norway in the early part of the 20th century, but now has been largely replaced by regional styles of bunader. Many Norwegians in the United States adopted nasjonaldrakt at the time of independence and continued to wear it longer than in Norway. Although many Norwegian-Americans have acquired regional styles, nasjonaldrakt remains popular today, especially in communities on the east coast of the United States, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and if you were here for Siv Ringdahl's film, we saw some dancers wearing nasjonaldrakt. And it's also been popular with dance groups nationwide. It's iconic and identifiable as Norwegian to all audiences. American materials can be substituted, making it relatively easy to create without special patterns or imported elements. During the cultural revival in Norway in the early 20th century, there was also an interest in regional bunader. Folk dancers were among the first to try to revive the different styles from rural Norway. When folk dress had completely died out in some areas, work often began to create a bunad for the local community. Depending on how much historic material was available, some regional bunader are firmly rooted in tradition, and others are merely inspired by it. There have also been creative adaptations of bunader, particularly in North America. Working from memory or photographs, some Americans have sewn Norwegian-looking costumes from locally available materials. In Ames, Iowa, Semmelina Stevenson followed the general cut of the Voss-bunad on the left, but departed from tradition in her choice of fabric. The bodice and skirt are red silk, trimmed in soft green. Why Semmelina used silk instead of woolen velvet might have to do with availability, or it may have had to do with the taste of the wearers, who were her college-age daughters. In anticipation of what would become an annual city festival, organizers of Nordic Fest in 1967 encouraged the residents of Decorah, Iowa, to make costumes to add to the Norwegian atmosphere of the event. Many women responded to the call and made outfits for themselves and their families. Although photos of the festival show a great number of creative interpretations and nasjonaldrakt, there are dresses that appear to have been made with Norwegian sewing patterns or Norwegian fabric. Louise Flickinger's outfit consisted of a blue and white striped skirt, deep blue bodice with pewter clasps, and a white blouse and apron with woven trim, and these fabrics appear to perhaps be from Norway. Louise wore the costume at Nordic Fest for 25 years while she was working. She could celebrate her own heritage and honor the many Norwegians and Norwegian-Americans that passed through the door of her family's grocery store, one that her immigrant father established in 1893. Increasingly, Americans are choosing regionally and historically based bunader rather than creating their own interpretations. The shift in the US toward regional styles reflects trends in Norway to have more historically authentic bunader, as well as ones that may be more similar to clothing worn by ancestors. This may relate to the upswing in interest in genealogy and participations in Bygdelag. A Bygdelag is a national organization of Americans who come from or whose ancestors come from a certain part of rural Norway. These groups began to form in 1899 as a way for members to celebrate local Norwegian customs, including dialect. Many Bygdelag are active today, and each offers genealogical resources and an annual gathering called a stevne. Stevne feature a variety of educational programs about Norwegian history, traditions, and genealogy. Members can meet and reconnect with relatives and spend several days exploring and celebrating heritage. Elaine Hasselton explains all of this very well. The stevne plays an important role in the Norwegian-American arena, she says. It's a time to show off ethnicity. At every stevne, the bunad plays a key role. Part of your identity is your bunad. It tells your ethnicity and differentiates you from other Norwegian-Americans. In addition to heading the National Council of Bygdelag, Elaine is a professional genealogist in Salt Lake City, Utah. She has a West Telemark bunad that she can wear to any of the stevna she attends. Wearing a bunad can make a strong visual statement of Norwegian ethnicity, and sharing the story of the bunad furthers the experience for both wearer and audience. The bunad story is often shared informally as the wearer gets compliments or questions. The story can also be shared as part of the narration for bunad style shows that are the highlight of most stevna. The bunad story includes information on how the person acquired the bunad, for example, whether it was made in Norway or inherited. In explaining why the wearer has that particular bunad, she or he also shares some personal history. Was a grandfather from that part of Norway or a great-grandmother? So here's an example of a bunad story. Lois Pieper had a Voss bunad made for her in the 1970s because she had started doing Norwegian things, as she described it, in the city of Stoughton, Wisconsin. She wore her bunad when she emceed the parade for Stoughton's 17. Mai, or 17th of May, or Norwegian Constitution Day, on public television for 14 years. She also helped narrate the bunad style show. 3 of her 4 grandparents were from Voss. She grew up in Minnesota and lived in Stoughton, but she considers Voss as the heart. Having a Voss bunad has been very important to her. Lois gave the bunad to her daughter, Carolyn Benferrato, in about 2016. Carolyn describes the outfit as a totem of heritage, a connection to her mother and to other relatives and back to Norway. She recently finished the embroidery on the headdress. Although it may seem that genealogical material and information is shared to legitimize one's connection to the bunad, it's more about the opportunity that the story gives for discovering that the wearer and the audience have a connection. The connection might be through family or through a shared experience such as travel. When you wear the bunad, you need to be prepared to answer questions. Wearers welcome the questions and the opportunity to share their bunad story. When Ellen Lavernier wears her bunad, she often gets the question, "What is it?" But if she's among Norwegian-Americans, the question is, "Which one is it?" because they recognize it as a bunad. In Norway, telling which bunad is often unnecessary, especially in small and rural communities where many people have the same bunad. So the bunad story is much more about who has made it or how you've inherited it. The combination of wearing a bunad and recounting family history is an essential part of Norwegian-American identity. It's not enough for some wearers to have a bunad that represents the county or district from which their ancestors came. They want to have a bunad that is closely tied to the ancestor and family farm or church parish. As Amy Boxrud of Northfield, Minnesota has begun to connect with her family near Eidsvoll, she said that she would like to find out what was worn there. She would do due diligence and find the most appropriate outfit if her father had stayed on the farm. While some Americans think that the reconstructed styles, the bunader copied from folk dress from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, looks too old-fashioned, it's those very stylistic details that help some wearers feel close to the place and time of their ancestors. Although I'm focusing on bunader today, there are other options for expressing heritage through clothing. A Norwegian sweater represents Norway to the wearer and to others. They're appropriate for women and for men, and are practical for cold climates. Because they are often expensive, they are treated like other special occasion clothing. And like the bunad, the story is often important. Reverend Alan Vick has a dozen Norwegian sweaters. One of the reasons he wears them is for heritage. Another reason is they remind him of when he first met Janice in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was teaching school and representing a Norwegian business by selling Norwegian sweaters. Alan came over to see one of her roommates. He met Janice, he bought a sweater, they started dating, etc. A t-shirt with a Norwegian theme is an inexpensive option and a practical choice for summer festivals and family reunions. Although a t-shirt wasn't designed as a special occasion garment, it can still have an important place in some Norwegian-American wardrobes. For David Susag, t-shirts can also be imbued with meaning and memory. He seeks out shirts connected to travel and activities, and especially those with Norwegian language inscriptions. He likes when people stop and ask what the t-shirt says, because it gives him an opportunity to share more about Norwegian culture. He can also promote some of his favorite places, like North House Folk School, and activities like woodworking. This t-shirt doesn't just give a Norwegian toast, it gives an opportunity for David to explain that skål also means bowl, and he can talk about making bowls as a wood turner. The desire to express a Norwegian and American identity is most evident in the handful of U.S. bunader that have been designed to represent communities in the United States, much like bunader have been designed in Norway to represent cultural history and natural environment of the Norwegian communities. The Petersburg, Alaska bunad was the first U.S. bunad completed in about 1960. Since then, at least 8 regional American bunader have been developed, and most of those are still in use. 60 years ago, Alma Wallen and Solveig Simonsen helped to start the Little Norway Festival, and soon after designed the Petersburg bunad. Using the bunad for Bergen as inspiration, they embroidered deep flourishes of Alaska and Mitkof Island flowers on the skirt. The dress is bright blue with a coordinated purse and cap. The bunad has been especially popular for residents who did not have a strong connection to any particular region of Norway. A group of women from the local Sons of Norway Lodge made simplified Petersburg bunads for the local dance troupe. The original Petersburg bunad has had a life of its own as an option for adult members of the local community, though some other U.S. bunader have been designed primarily as performance outfits. Norwegian costumes can enhance the cultural experience of the performers and the audience. While some dance and musical groups like the effect of different bunader, other groups prefer a more unified look and wear nasjonaldrakt or a bunad that they have created especially for the group. The process of designing and wearing a U.S. bunad can strengthen the bond among members and set members apart from other cultural groups, thereby helping to create a special identity within a larger Norwegian-American group identity. Founded in 1975, Metroplex Likeringen was a dance troupe made up of Norwegian Society of Texas members from Fort Worth, Arlington, and Dallas. They had performed a few times wearing a hodgepodge of garments that they described as attic bunads, and decided they needed an official outfit for an upcoming tour to Norway. Director Eudoris Dahl headed the Texas group that created the dance costumes. They started with a design that a Minnesota artist had created in rose mauling that included Texas wildflowers, the tail of the state bird, a lone star, and cross-hatching to represent oil derricks, because the oil industry is important to both Norway and to Texas. The motifs were machine embroidered onto deep blue cotton blend fabric. They weren't sure about the length, so they arbitrarily decided on 10 inches off the floor. Dancer Mary Blaha told me that 10 inches was long enough to twirl and modest enough not to flash anyone. Many Norwegian bunader have fantasy flowers, and she likes that the Texas bunad has real flowers in the embroidery. And that would be Texas wildflowers like bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush. Eudoris completed the first dress in January of 1988. Although it was quickly adopted as the official bunad for the Norwegian Society of Texas, it was generally reserved for the dancers. Metroplex Likeringen disbanded in about 2015, but the retired dancers continued to wear their Texas bunader at society events. Inger Langsholt and the students in her Norwegian language class designed a bunad to represent Illinois. In the same way that many Norwegian groups have developed bunader for their own communities, the Illinoisans placed meaningful motifs on a dress with a common bunad silhouette. They selected the state tree, bird, and insect, as well as regional wildflowers for the embroidery designs. All of the students grew up on area farms, so there's corn, and Inger suggested adding an element to represent barbed wire, which is a local invention. Barb Johnson finished her bunad in the fall of 2013. Quote, "We are celebrating our heritage and history. The ancestors wanted land and to farm. The Illinois bunad represents the past and the present," end quote. Inger explains, "We are not trying to outdo Norway or upset anyone. I felt we needed something that was American and Norwegian." Barb and Inger were speaking about the Illinois bunad specifically, but their desire to show something of their ancestry as well as of themselves and their Norwegianness as well as their Americanness, all in a single outfit, is a sentiment expressed by many wearers of bunader, but especially the U.S. bunader. Some U.S. bunader offer adaptations for climate and practicality of use. The bunad for Spring Grove, Minnesota, was planned as a working bunad and as a bunad for summer, the season of special community events. It's not always comfortable to wear a wool bunad, nor is it appropriate to be wearing a fest wool bunad when preparing and serving food. A cotton bunad meant there was no need to compromise on cultural expression. The primary reason for creating a bunad for their community was to express a local identity. According to the daughter of a wearer, the Spring Grove identity is very strong. People identify as being from Spring Grove first and the Norwegian-American second. They could have all worn different Norwegian bunads, but they wanted a Spring Grove bunad. When Marion Keebaugh moved to Stoughton, Wisconsin, she saw that people had an interest in Norwegian costumes, but they were just wearing a red vest or a black skirt. In 1990, she began working on a bunad for Stoughton. She wanted it to be an artistic design made from locally available materials that reflected the specific heritage of the city. It took her a year to create the outfit that was, quote, thoroughly Stoughton. The bodice in red or green wool, trimmed with black velvet and braid, is similar in cut to the bodices from Sogn and Voss. There's a breastplate like Voss, but rather than with beads, it's decorated with embroidery based on the flowers found in old Trøndelag folk art. The embroidery on the blouse is reminiscent of that on telemark blouses, and a Numedal-style apron brings the outfit together. The various components reflect the places in Norway from which many early Stoughton settlers had come. And in this way, the approach to the design is different from the other ones, most of the other U.S. bunader. The outfit further reflects the spirit of Stoughton because Ethel Qualheim, a local resident and nationally recognized rosemaler, created the design for the breastplate. Marion debuted the bunad at the 1997 Sitten Mai celebration. In 2000, Rode Strader and Ruth Dietzman created a man's bunad for Stoughton, using colors and embroidery motifs to complement the woman's bunad. In Norway, and especially in the United States, fewer men own and wear bunader. There are several reasons for this lack of interest, including the perception that bunader are primarily a female thing. Among wearers of this Stoughton bunad, however, the interest is a little bit more balanced. There are at least a dozen women's and a handful of men's Stoughton bunads. Helen Carberg decided to get a Stoughton bunad soon after Marion Keebaugh debuted the design in 1997. Kent Carberg was the first man to have a Stoughton bunad in 2000. They wear them as often as they can, including the bunad show at Stoughton's 3-day Sitten Mai celebration. During the festival, they're frequently stopped on the street with questions and requests for photographs. Regional bunader, like the Stoughton bunad, seem to be a United States phenomenon and not a North American one. There is not a Canada bunad, and there is unlikely ever to be one, according to Susan Strong, a cultural director for Sons of Norway who lives in British Columbia. Susan says that there is a distinct preference among Norwegian Canadians for traditional bunader and other historic traditions. It's more important where people are from than who people are now, she said. Not all Norwegian Americans know where exactly their ancestors are from, yet want to take part in cultural activities and express their ethnic identity by wearing a bunad. Kata Synnøve Nilsen of Sandefjord, Norway, had the idea to create a bunad for Americans who did not know which district their ancestors had come from. The motifs on the resulting Norwegian-American emigration bunad include symbols of popular culture to celebrate both the very first Norwegians to arrive in North America in the year 1000 and the mass migration that began in 1825. Norwegian and American flags remind wearers of the old country and new home. Stylized floral motifs from rosemalling represent the breadth of emigration because this folk art is common in many communities across Norway. The figure of Leif Erikson is pointing west, perhaps directing his crew from Norway to America, or sending 19th century settlers across the continent to new homes represented by a covered wagon and log cabin. Nilsen added long wool streamer to the purse, and these long wool streamers are not appearing on historic purses, but it did allow her a place for some of these motifs. Norskadalen Nature and Heritage Center in Coon Valley, Wisconsin, is both an arboretum and a Norwegian-American historical museum. Volunteers wrote a grant to the Wisconsin Art Board to design and create a bunad. The bunad would, of course, feature wildflowers in embroidery on the apron and purse. The cut was based on a Gudbrandsdal bunad because many people from Gudbrandsdal settled in the area. Red trim on the apron was borrowed from Telemark bunader to honor those immigrants. The first bunad was completed in 2008, and since then a dozen kits have been sold. It was meant to be washable and practical for volunteers, guides, members, and local residents. It was also meant to blend Norwegian heritage and American creativity. We've been talking about different bunader for communities with large populations of Norwegian immigrants and Norwegian-Americans, and Decorah, Iowa certainly fits that description. Is there a Decorah bunad? No, but there was the idea for one. Margaret Homry made a bunad for herself to wear. She used her daughter's Valdres bunad as a pattern for the dress. In embroidery, she adapted a rosemalling design and used a washable fabric because she intended to wear it a lot, including at Decorah's Nordic Fest in July. Margaret's daughter decided that the dress would be a bunad for Decorah, but the idea lost momentum after Margaret died in 1993. When I've spoken to bunad wearers about U.S. bunader, the reaction is mixed. Some Americans are unaware of them, but many think the idea of a bunad for a place that is not located in Norway is almost absurd. They shouldn't be called bunader because they're not recognized as bunader in Norway. There were many positive comments as well. Helen Carberg shared the reaction when she wears her Stoughton bunad. Quote, "A lot of people are impressed. They think it's pretty nice that Stoughton thought so much about Norwegian culture to have their own bunad," end quote. Whether there should or should not be bunader for places in the United States, there are U.S. bunader. Many Americans feel a close connection to the place their relatives came from in Norway and want to show the connection through dress. A bunad says where your people are from. Other Americans want to celebrate their personal identity as Norwegian and American. A United States bunad says that you are Norwegian by the very fact that it's styled like a bunad, but it can also say that you are American by the selection of motifs and symbols. Expressing both Norwegian heritage and American pride of place can be important and appears to be increasingly important to women and men in the United States with Norwegian ancestry. Scholar Stephen Schnell observed a similar trend in Lindsborg, Kansas, where Swedish costumes have come to symbolize the present more than the past and have become local, current symbols of place and community. Although there is not a distinctive Lindsborg costume like there's a bunad for Petersburg, Alaska, for example, there is a desire to show where you're from. At the same time, you show where your ancestors are from. U.S. bunader can play another role. One informant said that she did not have Norwegian ancestry, but she had always wanted a bunad to feel more a part of community events. To have a bunad from a specific place in Norway wouldn't mean very much, she said. Having one from the place where she's lived for the last 20 years was a wonderful solution. Several of the people I interviewed identified themselves as Norwegian by osmosis or Norwegian by marriage. It's not uncommon for people that live in Norwegian communities or are involved with cultural activities, at first due to family or other obligations, to feel a strong sense of belonging and choose to be included in Norwegian activities and include Norwegian elements in their expression of identity. Several communities have crowned royalty as part of their 17. Mai or other special events. Young women and men apply to win a scholarship and serve as community and cultural ambassadors. Typically, royalty wear Norwegian costumes when crowned and each time they serve in their official capacity. Westby, Wisconsin has selected a princess and 2 attendants as part of their 17. Mai festivities since 1970. Candidates must wear a bunad for the interview portion of the competition, and they are often asked about them. This isn't meant as an opportunity to share a personal bunad story, though. If the question is, tell me about what you're wearing, the candidate might say what a bunad is before including it in a list of ethnic activities during the event. It's less important to be recognized as having a connection to a specific place in Norway, and more important to have a way to begin talking about Norwegian traditions, and perhaps to test these candidates in how well they would serve as an ambassador of the event and of the community. In Westby, creative interpretations are very common. So common, in fact, that my informants made special note of the handful of candidates that had worn bunader embroidered in Norway. Norwegian-made bunader are too expensive and not practical for hot weather, they said. So the community has embraced less expensive, lighter weight, and locally sourced fabrics. One of those sources has been a fabric store in New Glarus, Wisconsin. So although those machine-embroidered fabrics were imported from Switzerland, they felt to the community to give a pan-European effect. Recently, the community has begun celebrating the history of the royalty program through a fundraiser for its scholarship by auctioning off a doll dressed like a specific princess from the program's past. Dorothy Stoffergen has made 6 dolls of the princesses from the 1970s. In talking with her and with Betty Stolesen, who's made bunader for several of the candidates, it's clear that the local community plays an important role in defining what Norwegian is and what bunader are. Another example of the latitude that Westby residents have felt within the definition of Norwegian bunad was a bunad design contest, also held during 17. Mai. Sponsored by the local bank, you would pick up a doll and a dress pattern, sew an outfit, and return the doll for judging. There were 4 awards plus People's Choice, and judging was based on the originality of the dress, craftsmanship, and sewing. Did the dress need to look like one from Norway? No, there were no restrictions. You can see from the entries in 1996 that many of the dolls are dressed in outfits that approximate Norwegian regional bunader, but the grand prize winner on the left in the front row seems to be inspired by other ethnic traditions with the large puff sleeves. There's one more clothing option that I'd like to share with you today. Festdrakt is the term used in Norway today to describe a festive outfit that falls somewhere between a bunad and a ball gown, or bunad couture. Where a bunad strongly represents historic, rural, and regional Norway, a festdrakt has a modern, urban, and national Norwegian appeal that resonates with many Norwegians and some Americans. Lisa Skjåkbræk of Trondheim, Norway, has been at the forefront of festdrakt. She takes inspiration from Norway's rich cultural heritage of folk dress, textiles, and other folk art. Tradition and aesthetics are equally important for her designs of festdrakt. Because bunader are rooted in rural tradition, she finds that many contemporary urban Norwegians feel little attachment to any local region. Originality is important to Lisa and her clients. Quote, 40 years ago, there would be 4 girls wearing bunad in a confirmation. Now there are 4 not wearing bunad. All the clothes look alike, which creates the urge to have something that is special and relates to you and to your country. When bunader became so popular, they also became a stereotype. Now they all look alike. In the old days, we had variations by color, embroidery, scarves, and trim on the apron. It was the same style, but with variety. Where we created new bunader, they must look like this, which created the bunad police. Festdrakt gives you an opening to not look like everyone else in your community. In addition to the hundreds of clients in Norway, Lisa has a handful in the US, the result of a special exhibition in 2015 at Norway House in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Linda Brekke Mona, who has been a chair of the board of directors at the center, purchased a festdrakt because she wanted something contemporary, evocative of Norway. Wearing a bunad would seem like what would be a costume, where festdrakt seemed like a beautiful gown that she could wear at special events in her everyday life. There is interest in Norway for composing and sewing your own bunad, or your festdrakt, Fabrik is an Oslo company established in 2020 by Jenny Skavlan, Ingrid Bergtun, Mari Nordén, and Ingrid Vik Lisna here in the front row, to offer sustainable alternatives to the ever-increasing waste produced by the clothing industry. They offer a wide range of patterns, surplus textiles, and sewing supplies to help women develop their skills, make their own clothes, repair and extend the life of existing garments, and become more self-sufficient. And this vision extends to festdrakt. I'm going to quote fashion historian Ragnhild Brochmann. Quote, in a time when the national costume has become as expensive as a month's salary, when traditionalists like Husfliden have to outsource production to Eastern Europe and Asia to keep up with orders, when the level of people's craft skills has hardly been lower and children no longer learn to sew and knit, isn't it time for a new popular movement that takes it upon itself to be learned again? If you want to sew a formal dress from your mother's old curtains, you do it. From your grandmother's coffee tablecloth with lilacs, you do it. In short, Fabrik tells you that a bunad can be sewn reasonably easily and without approval from the infamous bunad police. And most importantly, that you can easily get a dress that no one else has, end quote. Fabrik's efforts are about helping wearers add themselves, their time, their skill, their personality, and maybe even personal materials to the outfits so that they represent Norway and themselves. Although the number of Americans with bunader is greater now than in past years, that number is still quite a small percentage of people with Norwegian ancestry. Many reasons exist for why Americans with Norwegian ancestry do not wear bunader. For some, it's the complexity and expense of acquiring one. Others feel that they don't have enough occasions to wear one. A bunad may feel more like a theater costume. Some don't feel they need to express their heritage at all, or at least not through their clothing. And 2 women explained to me that the reason that they did not have bunader was that their mothers did not. But for many Norwegian Americans, acquiring and wearing a bunad is a significant expression of ethnic identity. More than other markers, such as joining a cultural organization or preparing traditional food, wearing a bunad is a very public act and requires a commitment of time and money. Wearing a bunad, any bunad, shows that you are Norwegian or have Norwegian ancestry. In addition to expressing this group identity, the choice of bunad and the choice of specific elements of the bunad can further express an individual identity. As has been found in the Swedish community of Lindsborg, Kansas, wearers of Norwegian costumes in the United States seek increasingly individualized outfits to reflect personal taste, genealogy, a sense of place, and even life experiences. And we are starting to see this more now in Norway with options such as festdrakt. Wearing a bunad isn't always enough for some Americans. The bunad or sweater or t-shirt story, shared informally through conversation or formally through the narration in public style shows, is also an important form of expression of Norwegian ethnicity in the United States. It's an opportunity for wearers to demonstrate both Norwegian group identity and personal identity, as well as to make connections with other Norwegian Americans through the details revealed in the story. The bunad story is also one of the forms of communication between the two countries. The stories are part of a steady stream of information about bunader, including styles, meanings, and evolving options. The stream is fed through family relationships, travel, participation in U.S. cultural organizations and festivals, and popular literature, such as Sons of Norway's Viking magazine. Although direct communication and direct connection with the homeland may not be as frequent or as intensive as scholars might deem as transnational, these activities taken as a whole have indeed shaped the custom of wearing bunader, and in some cases, the bunader themselves, in the United States. The desire to wear a bunad is not necessarily related to how recently family members have immigrated from Norway. Some of the immigrants I interviewed had grown up with bunader, others had not. 6th and 7th generation Norwegian-Americans are now seeking bunader as a way of connecting with their ethnic heritage. The bunad can be an expression of ethnicity by ancestry and by choice. The role of community, family, city, bygdelag, in fostering a sense of belonging through educating, encouraging, and even defining what a bunad is, should not be overlooked and is a recommendation for further research. Thank you to the many individuals who spoke with me about their clothing choices, and thank you for attending.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. We do have a few minutes for questions, and I'd be happy to bring the microphone up to anyone who has a question for Lorraine. Okay, I see you first, and then I'll come down here.
Thanks. I enjoyed seeing how Americans have adopted some of these regional influences in their bunads. In Norway, I'm curious, with the influx of migrants from other regions like the Pakistanis and so on, have you seen any kind of merger with their traditions, with Norwegian traditional bunads, or is that still kind of separate?
There are some with the more historically based bunader. What we're seeing sometimes in Norway now with some immigrants is perhaps the addition of a traditional headdress such as hijab with a bunad. And other people who might want to express even more ethnic identity might go the route of festdrakt, these sort of almost party dress ball gown, because it feels like the Norwegian community feels more latitude there to look somewhat Norwegian, but add more of yourself. So maybe some fabric from your home country, or even a piece of a family textile as part of that. So with the more historically based bunader, it's somewhat limited currently with what people feel comfortable seeing in the way of an immigrant's own identity, and more latitude in that festdrakt category. Great question.
I have a question about beadwork. And it isn't used in very many of the Norwegian bunads, or bunader. But when did the beads come to Norway? When did they learn beadwork in Norway? I mean, it obviously came from Italy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Italy and
did
Czech
they ever
Republic.
see the parallels when they came to this country between Native American beadwork, who also were introduced to beads at probably about the same time, and their own work?
It's certainly possible. I don't have any examples where where immigrants have said, the Native Americans in my area are doing beadwork that looks similar to things I'm accustomed to, or doing other techniques with similar motifs. Certainly now, if we look at different traditions, we see these parallels and maybe it's universality of design, that you can only do so many things with a natural resource, that maybe you need to do a geometric motif, or that when we stylize floral motifs, they often look the same regardless of who's making them. And it would be fascinating to know if anyone recognized that, if a Norwegian immigrant from the West Coast, where beaded breastplates are common, if they noticed any beadwork here or weaving that looked familiar. But unfortunately, I haven't seen any direct evidence that this was noted.
Just to pick up on Brigitta's question, in Rolvag's Giants in the Earth, there's one chapter where the Norwegian immigrants from the northern Norway are come in contact with Native Americans, and two things are done in that chapter of this work of fiction to establish some kind of cultural identity between these two disparate groups. On the one hand, Per has run out of tobacco, and so he asks the Indians to share their tobacco with him, and they smoke together. Without Per realizing that, he participates then in a native ceremony. And the other thing is that he asks, when he's meeting with these natives, he asks one of their children to run up and ask their mother to come down. And so Berit comes down, but before she does, she puts on her best dress. Her best dress would, of course, be a bunad. And once again, a Norwegian bunad, possibly with beadwork on it, establishes a kind of cultural identity with the festal attire of the native people. Mm-hmm. So there's one example in fiction.
Thank you, John.
Sorry about the travel time.
Thank you so much for an interesting talk. My name is Ingarild Grønrud, and I come from Kongsvinger in Norway. And I, of course, have the bunad of the area. But I just want to share with you that my friend who worked at a store that provided bunads, Tante Maria, the store, she was adopted from Korea, and she didn't feel that she could use a bunad. So when she was confirmated, she couldn't have it because she didn't look Norwegian enough. But that was her own sentencing. So now it's changed. Well, one of your colleagues is from a state in Africa and has bought a bunad, so it's changing because I was confirmed in 1990. So it changes over time. But I have to tell you something about the last time I was here in America. I visited Seminoles in Native Americans in Florida, and I bought a bag, embroidered bag, and I was so overwhelmed that the pattern of the star was the same as in Trøndelag, Trøndelagsrose, that we use when we knit sweaters and everything. So I think it's universal patterns that keep showing up all over. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And certainly there's so much more nuance, especially in the history of folk dress, which became bunad in Norway, and how it's used today. So thank you for that example.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I have noticed in the news, maybe the last 5, 8 years, something like that, Norwegian women wearing their bunad in protest, in solidarity. Is that anything that you can comment on, or anybody in the audience? I'm just curious, like how that got started and what's the story behind that?
It'd be great if someone had any perspective. I know that at one point when Norway was considering joining the EU, there was an EU bunad made as a form of protest that had the colors of the EU flag and some other symbolism made on it, more as it was something wearable, but more as an art object to make a statement. It wasn't that many people were wearing it. There is a community in southern Norway that has created some bunads from recycled materials as a way to draw attention to the fact about the amount of trash in the oceans. And so they wanted to use garbage bags for the dress, and maybe it was a bottle cap for pieces. And so that's another time when it's been a little bit more of a political, or a statement, I should say, not necessarily political, but a statement using this garment that is recognized across Norway. Are there other examples that people are aware of? Yes, we've got one back here.
Yes, there are other examples. Bunad-geriljaen, a lot of women got together to protest that the maternity area in hospitals were closed down because they needed to build bigger hospitals, and it was very far from all mothers to be. So it has been protesting, Bunad-geriljaen. It was, when was it? 2019, yeah. In Ålesund, I think, and in the western parts where they were building big hospitals. And that's, I don't know what to call it, maybe new public management thing to just to forget to consider who's the patient. So it's, important protest, I think.
Yeah, wonderful.
And they succeeded in some ways and some ways not. So, yeah.
Perfect. And you can see with these examples that this is a living tradition. It's not just we're dressing like people did in the past. There's a life to this and its own uses and communications. How exciting.
And of course, there's the example of Sami Gakti being worn by environmental protesters in the Sami community in Oslo as well. It's been happening a lot with the wind farms being put up on reindeer herding and grazing and birthing lands.
And I didn't talk about gakti, the Sami clothing, here in this particular presentation, but if you're interested in the American perspective on that, of how Norwegians of Sami descent have been negotiating their own history and deciding what to wear here, I can refer you to an article I wrote for El Palacio, the magazine for the Museum of Folk Art in Santa Fe, where I dealt with that separately.
Other questions while we've got a few minutes here? I've actually got one. I'll cede the floor to you and then I'll close it.
It was just a comment on how the folkedrakt has been adjusted to the diversity of the Norwegian population at this point. Last year there was a company called Ada that has produced different kinds of folkedrakts with patterns from around the world incorporated the same, which resembles the way that Norwegian-Americans has dealt with how to this is a vocabulary that I don't have in English. But how to, so how to be dressing as a Norwegian, but still with parts of your identity and your roots from other places. So you can see that, for instance, the one from Africa, you can see that there's some African textile in the apron or in the vest, or from Latin America with the same thing. So you could look up Ada for pictures of that.
Well, that's sort of an interesting prequel to a question I had, which was, how do you, and maybe it's not something that really can be answered, but it's interesting to me to see these shifts happening between ethnic identity and regional or local identity being expressed through these bunads, and those processes seem to be happening on both sides of the Atlantic, and with shifting local demographics that it's reflected in choices that people are making to include other traditions and other identities within a dress tradition that might have been very local and felt entrenched at one point, but then there's a breaking free to create more inclusion. So I guess that's not much of a question, but more of a comment.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Anna.
Oh yeah.
I'd like to get a opinion from you about the future and your opinion about the decline of, I think that you had mentioned this, the decline of people doing handwork. I know there's in certain instances, especially here in folk schools, people are very interested in, making their own wool. But on the other hand, just this decline in the people who sew for husflid, because there used to be many people who that was a way to make money, by embroidering and then submitting to husflid and making the bunad. So what do you think?
Well, it's certainly true that some of the more specialized skills for making a bunad, the tailoring, some of the more complicated construction, those skills are rapidly being lost, that people, for the most part, are not making their own clothing for every day, and certainly not for family members, so there's those tailoring skills are being lost. But there's definitely an interest, both in Norway, but even in the United States too, to the makers movement, to make something yourself, whether it's knitting or embroidery, and maybe it's just something small and decorative, but I think it's still showing that people have an interest, they feel the joy in creating, and this could expand to something like a garment. The company Festrukt or Fabrik in Oslo, their business is very much about everyday clothing as well, and they're hoping that they can help women and men learn the skills so they can make more of their own clothing. And so perhaps in the future we'll see that this isn't a huge dip in skill and ability and interest, that it's more of a smaller dip, and that we're coming back up. And I think in Norway in particular, people are lamenting the fact that children aren't learning to sew or knit in grade school, which they had for many, many years. And so I think there might be a reverse of some of that. But some of the tailoring skills, especially for the men's bunader, I think are going to remain a specialist skill, and it's going to be a smaller group of people that either make men's bunader for other people or teach courses, and you require a lot of assistance for that because that's really very specialized. But hopefully we'll see a revival with that kind of handcraft as well as other kind of handwork that we're seeing. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, one quick question and then we're at time, but yeah.
I guess sort of a comment or like a fun thing that I've learned since like learning about bunads, which was really not that long ago, maybe a couple years. And I learned how, as a departure from the bunad, I learned how to knit while I was in Norway. And no one in my family knew how to knit. And I always felt this yearning towards it, same with sewing, but no one had the skills. And so during the pandemic, when I was in Norway, I sat a lot in my apartment, and I learned how to knit on YouTube. And what I've realized since coming back is that there are quite a lot of people in like my local community who are so interested in learning that skill set, and oftentimes it's like the question of how do we learn it. But one other thing I'd like to mention is that, you know, since people learned that I've, you know, learned like certain techniques in Norwegian knitting, for example, they'll ask me and come and do demonstrations. And in my community in Austin, Minnesota, where I live, we have a lot of recent immigrants from various places in Western Africa and Latinx communities, all that kind of stuff. And a point of connection is that we had this idea in this local, it's called the 4th Avenue Fest. It's kind of a cultural, kind of street festival. And we thought of, well, instead of just having knitting be the Norwegian demonstration, there's so many other communities who also knit, and what if we do knitting together, but reflect each of how it might look in our communities as a point of connection between different immigrant groups. And I just thought that was wonderful. We haven't done it yet, but I just thought it was such a wonderful idea of like bringing knitting more than just, you know, one specific cultural demonstration.
Sounds wonderful. And what a great way to connect with other people, to be able to ask them questions about their knitting techniques or the colors they're using as a way to break down those barriers. Wonderful.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you once again to Lorraine for sharing with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.